is true that in 1976, 2 weeks after my graduation from the University of Pennsylvania, I did start my journalistic career in the Norfolk area at the Ledger-Star. It was a very different period of journalism then. It really was the golden period, really a bygone period. It was the immediate aftermath of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein, and everybody wanted to be a journalist. We truly did see it as a calling, really as a noble calling. The public's right to know, not the kind of thing that you are now likely to see on a greeting card. We really, really believed it. I applied to 307 newspapers. I was offered a job in Casper, Wyoming, based on my ability to match the editor there drink for drink, even if I did sneak to the bathroom twice to vomit. I was offered a job in Roanoke, but being in a place where everybody addressed each other as Hokie or Hokies made me nervous. And finally there was the Ledger-Star, which was smart enough or probably dumb enough to hire me. I started in the Virginia Beach Bureau. It was the 200th anniversary of the country on July 4th, and the only place in the country that had trouble, there actually was a riot on the waterfront, and I'm now convinced it started over a parking space. This was my big chance to show who I was. I jumped into the company car. I was full of nerves and adrenaline. This was my big Jimmy Olsen moment, and it was only scarred by one thing. The company car was out of gas. It was not a good start, but I managed to persevere for the next 2.5 years. I wrote some stories that were good, and I wrote some stories that were bad and horrendously over the top and treacly and overwritten. I did manage also to alienate every editor that I worked for by being obnoxious and surly and rude and full of myself, because in other words, I was from New York. On the way here today, Lynn Walsh asked me if it was true that I once threw a typewriter out the window. And as a defendant says in every criminal trial, I have no recollection. There was a going away party in which all the editors cheered when I said I was leaving. And one said I should think of doing something else for a living, like robbing cars. But for better or worse, I stuck with journalism and writing it because I loved it. I loved writing, I loved reporting, and I really did see my mission as helping those who needed the greatest help. The forgotten that dot our American landscape all over this country with such little chance and such little hope. It is hard to be optimistic today because of the state of journalism and nonfiction writing today. We've all heard the stories, we've all read about them, we read about them all the time, the impending demise of the newspaper business and the magazine business and the book business, and these are changing times. And I will be honest, I wake up every day fearing that I am on the verge of a certain kind of obsolescence, becoming a dinosaur. Where do I fit in? Where do we all fit in the writing spectrum? I don't think anyone ever really anticipated the impact the internet would have, the way it would change at the speed of sound, the way we think, the way we read, the way we process, the way we gather information. It is profound, and it is scary, and it is unknown. But let's screw the internet for a while, at least for the next hour until I go on Twitter, which I like to do, and make an ass of myself to the point where my wife number 3 no longer talks to me except to call me a twiddiot. I consider myself incredibly lucky as a journalist and nonfiction writer to start when I did in that golden age. And as Lynn said, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable meant something. It meant something sacred, and it meant something precious. It is interesting to me that when I think of my career in journalism, which is now about 35 years, of course I think about what I've written and what I would do differently and what I liked and what I didn't like. But it's not the words that come to me as much as the faces, the glimmers of these faces. Faces of sadness, faces of tears, faces of need, faces of desperation. But in all those faces that I've seen, and other journalists and writers have seen, there has been a common thread. There is a glimmer in their eyes that this person across the kitchen table from you, this man or this woman who is a journalist, who is a nonfiction writer, will listen to you, will listen to your story, will find it valid and sympathetic and important, and try as hard as anyone can try to bring some right to what is so egregiously wrong. I think of people like Pat, and while I could tell us the names that mean nothing to you, when I was working on a piece for Vanity Fair a decade ago, I think of them in their humble home in a suburb of Kansas City, small, quiet home. I think of them sitting at the kitchen table, wondering how their son, their 21-year-old son, an Army private based at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, could have been beaten to death with a baseball bat by a fellow soldier in the same barracks in which they lived, after rumors had leaked out that he was gay. I remember how decent they were, how humble they were, but how strong they were in refusing to keep silent, whatever the risk, and wanting to know how and why, what had happened to their son, and why a military that was supposed to protect and honor their son for his service had done so little. Why it had taken 40 minutes for an ambulance to arrive as he lay in a bed bleeding to death. Inevitably, I think of Boobie Miles, the black running back that I wrote about in Friday Night Lights, my book about high school football in Texas. I can't help but think of the circumstances in which he grew up, given away by his mother, who was a crack addict, raised by a father who would tie him to a drawer and beat him with a belt, placed in a foster home in Houston until his uncle, the lovely and soulful and late LV, finally rescued him. I think of the circumstances in which he lived in Odessa, Texas, on the south side of town, below the railroad tracks, the poor side of town, the place, let's face it, most whites called the nigger and spick side of town. It was a shanty town in America, in rural America, because poverty and segregation and racism and hatred is not exclusive to the urban city. In every town in America, there is always the wrong side of the tracks. There is always the pocket of ghettoization. It is the second worst shame of a country that so proudly brags of being the richest on earth. But the worst shame is that those who live there, increasingly in our society today, they have become the forgotten. They have become the disappeared. They have become the disenfranchised. They have no voice. I think of Boobie Miles' front yard, which was mostly dirt with little tufts of grass sticking out, littered with the skeletal remains of cars that hadn't worked for years. And I think of his residence where he lived, a narrow and dilapidated shotgun house, narrow, one floor, scrappy wood bear that could literally blow away with the wind. But then I think of the joy Boobie felt as a high school football player at Permian High School in the late 1980s, the school that I wrote about, which was then the winningest team in Texas state history. And Boobie's knowledge, his pride, that he was one of the finest running backs in the state, if not the best. He was beautiful to watch. He was incredible to watch. He was gorgeous. I think of Boobie in the training room one day in high school when he was a senior, sitting on one of those trainers' tables, telling me his dreams, that he was going to play ball at Nebraska or Texas or A&M or Oklahoma, and then he was going to go on to the New York Jets. And to Boobie, they were not dreams. It was all a fait accompli, something that was destined, he knew, was destined to happen. There are many scenes and sights and sounds as a journalist that you never forget that become indelible. And perhaps the one that lingers the most to me is the one of Boobie Miles sitting in biology class, not listening to the teacher, and the teacher really not caring whether he had done any work because he had not. And I remember him, and I can see him. He was sitting in the back of the room, not paying attention, but opening a stack of recruiting letters. And I still remember the sound. I still remember that rip of those envelopes, one after the other. The wondrous universes being spun by these big-name schools beckoning, come here, you'll be a star, you'll be famous. The rip of those envelopes. And while I knew Boobie thought it was the sound of the football promised land, I knew it was the sound of tragedy. As adults, we decide what kids will become. We make judgments, and sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're bad, and sometimes they're indifferent. And the attitude about Boobie was simple. He was a football animal. He was someone who had no other skill or reason to be, someone for whom the very idea of teaching, preparing him for life, if there was no football, was considered a joke, unimportant, worthless. Most who met Boobie agreed that he was one of those kids for whom the game of football had become as important, as indispensable as a part of their bodies. Taking it away would be like amputating a leg. Some in town, most of them black, worried about what might happen to him if it somehow didn't work out, what the incredible effect of that absence might be. They saw something potentially dangerous in it all, and some in town, all of them white, gleefully suggested that Boobie Miles, without the ability to carry a football in his hand, might as well get a broom and start preparing for his other destiny in life, learning how to sweep the corners of storerooms. On other occasions, some whites offered another suggestion for Boobie's life if he no longer had football. Just do to him what a trainer did to a horse that had pulled up lame at the track. Just take out a gun and shoot him to put him out of the misery of a life that no longer had any value. What would Boobie be without football? Echoed a Permian coach when asked the question one day. The answer was obvious, as clear as night and day, black and white in Odessa, Texas. And the coach responded without the slightest hesitation. What would he be? A big old dumb nigger.